This video is dedicated to all the men and women of Columbia State University who work tirelessly each and every day to create the new race of super beings that will one day replace us all. Since its conception, the Challenger 2 has been one of the most controversial tanks in military enthusiast lore, until of course, it came, with its Honda Jazz engine and turbo cannon powered by the heart of a dead orphan, and a cloaking device that makes it so stealthy no one has ever seen it in combat, and something, I don't know, I stopped reading the comments. The Challenger 2 remains in a rather odd place in military enthusiast lore. For one, this is a community that is dominated largely by Americans, who think that everyone else should shut up, because if you're not an American, your opinion is invalid. And of course, the other side is dominated by Russian armor fans, who bought into the whole Western armor is made to make generals in the Pentagon rich, but Russian armor is built for war, etc, blah blah blah. In this argument, there is no real place for the tanks of other nations, who simply become the subjects of either ridicule or adoration depending on the changing culture of the community in question, and rarely does that have anything to do with the tank's actual performance. The Ariete, for example, the main battle tank of the Italians, is considered one of the worst main battle tanks in Europe, given its woeful cross-country performance and severe lack of armor. But it is loved by the community entirely because of one episode of Girls in Panzer, in which the Italians are painted as, yes, cash-strapped, but cheerful and enthusiastic, traits which have been transposed onto the Ariete. It's now a plucky tank. It's trying its best. It's just a little guy. Look at him go. It's absolutely not an icon of Italian corruption and poor manufacturing oversight. What on earth are you talking about? How dare you offend my tanku? I will fight you, you son of a bitch! In comparison, the Challenger 2 is hated, simply because British armor enthusiasts, known as Teaboos, are some of the worst people on the internet. They are arrogant, argumentative, highly sensitive, and so far up their own ass, it's amazing they can still see. For generations, calls of British detected your argument is invalid have been the hand-waving response to any of their walls of text, followed by brief and comedic discussions and all the cool Britain cancelled because it's basically poor. And as such, those traits have been applied to the Challenger 2. It is often mocked as the icon of British arrogance, of the failure of Britain to be able to properly afford a modern weapons program, and its self-centeredness which keeps it in a perpetual state of ignorance, believing that Britain can still go it alone, rather than face up to the inevitable reality that it is a former world power with a dying influence, and it's simply trying to stave off the inevitability of purchasing import tanks like the Abrams or Leopard 2s to remain combat relevant. But to the British, the Challenger is a point of pride. To them, it's the tank that defies the odds. In spite of the criticism, the Challenger 2 is an exceedingly capable tank, one which has proven unequal to its modern equivalents. It is in every way as capable as a baseline Abrams M1A2 and a Leopard 2A4, and in some respects even exceeds them in certain factors. It is exceptionally fast for its size, it is overall better protected, and it enjoys a somewhat better layout than the Leopard. And the accuracy of its rifled cannon, combined with its long-range laser optic system, has earned it a reputation as the sniper tank. Its predecessor, the Challenger 1, still holds the record for the longest tank-on-tank kill at just under 3 miles. But it is its unique armor that gives it its most distinctive characteristic. Chubham armor, sometimes incorrectly referred to as Dorchester, is a non-explosive reactive armor made out of hardened ceramic plates encased in a metal framework and covered in elastic. It offers vastly superior protection over regular composite armor, especially against shaped charges, heat rounds, and kinetic penetrators like Sabo. It is not the only tank which uses this, of course. The M1 Abrams and the South Korean K1 both use similar types of armor based on the same principles. And while the tank is not invincible and the armor definitely not impenetrable, it has proven itself countless times in combat. And in spite of the numerous Western tanks fitted with this style of armor that have been lost both in Ukraine and other conflicts, none have ever been taken out in a direct tank-on-tank action, making it difficult to judge the actual combat effectiveness of this armor, especially when it's classified just exactly how much of this armor covers the actual tank. In Iraq, one Challenger 2 suffered over 90 hits from Soviet-made RPG rounds, including an alleged Milan missile, and survived. In the same region, a number of Challengers came into contact with a superior number of T-55s and were able to destroy all of them without casualty, in spite of taking numerous hits. And though the military enthusiast community online may look at the Challenger 2 with disdain, in the world of actual experts, the Challenger is considered one of the best tanks in the world. I mean, not the best, because there is no such thing, but it's certainly up there. And to the British, that's all that matters. But of course, it's not all sunshine in Rule Britannia. There are downsides to an indigenous tank project, and being that the Challenger 2 has consistently failed to attract serious interest on the export market, it has meant that demand for additional hulls, guns and upgrades is basically null. Outside of Ukraine, which we'll discuss in a bit, only 2 other countries have ever operated Challenger 2s. Oman operates a fleet of 38 hulls, 18 of which are tanks, the rest are training, repair and specialist vehicles. In 2022, 14 Challenger 2s with British crews were placed under Polish command in order to offset the loss of Poland's T-72 fleet, which had donated to Ukraine. This lack of foreign export has meant that the cost of upgrading the tanks has remained fairly high. The Challenger 2E, an export variant which incorporated a lot more Eurocentric systems commonly found on the Leclerc and K2, was cancelled in 2005 after it failed to attract interest from either Greece or India. And with Britain not having the funds, or real need, to maintain a large tank fleet, it has meant that, with the exception to some necessary upgrades to its survival and armor packages, such as the Street Fighter upgrade, which saw the frontal ERA system replaced with the same ceramic armor that covers the rest of the tank, the Challenger has remained largely in the same state it was when it was built in the 90s. The rifle gun means it cannot use the more modern and more powerful NATO rounds, and its rifling causes significant wear on the barrel. It uses 2-piece ammunition, which cuts into the reload time, and it's furiously heavy. And though it has an extremely powerful engine capable of propelling the 60-ton Challenger 2 at 40 miles an hour, making it just as fast as the 48-ton T-90, it does struggle on inclines and softer terrain. And though a more powerful engine variant of the Challenger 2 does exist and was trialled, which solved this problem, the increased power-to-weight ratio caused the tracks to frequently, well, fall off. This is on top of that rifled gun being... Actually, let's talk about that. One of the biggest misconceptions of the Challenger 2 is the link between its famously rifled gun and its accuracy. A lot of online pundits believe that the rifling does nothing for accuracy and the whole thing is in fact a myth, because as we all know, rifling has absolutely no effect on accuracy whatsoever, and that's why all sniper rifles are smoothbore. Rifles! Sniper rifles! Why do you think it's called a rifle? Look, I don't know why people believe that or where that came from, but I'm looking at Reddit. They know I'm looking at them. I can see them shuffling their feet and trying to hide their posts behind their... I see you doing that! Stop it! The thing is, the rifling on the Challenger 2's tank barrel is not a yes it is, no it isn't when it comes to its acclaimed accuracy. The Challenger's accuracy is proven, and it's going to become very important when we talk about how it's doing in Ukraine. But where the confusion may be coming from may be more to do with how rifling affects modern tank shells. Hesh rounds, which the British are absolutely obsessed with, do benefit greatly from a rifled barrel. The spinning not only makes the shot far more accurate, it also increases the spread of the interior explosive, greatly increasing the effect of the round. It was for this reason that the British kept the rifled barrel. The Hesh round is incredibly important in terms of British tank doctrine. It makes the tank exceedingly good at infantry support, which has been its biggest advantage over other tank designs. When a squad of Challengers got ambushed in Iraq in the worst environment for a tank to be in, urban combat, many of the tankers proclaimed it was the power of those Hesh rounds that saved them, not the tank's armor. Hesh rounds are extremely effective against bunkers and dug-in positions, which made them highly valuable in the Iraq theater, where the Iraqis stuck to heavily fortified urban environments that allowed them to run between different firing positions while remaining in cover. The downside is that while Hesh rounds work great with rifling, sable rounds do not. In fact, they work the opposite. A spinning tungsten sabre dart is considerably less effective and less accurate. Thus, British sabre rounds have to carry special rings which counter the spinning effect from the rifling. This makes the Challenger slightly less effective at countering enemy armor than the more modern Abrams and Leopard tanks, and is quite possibly where the confusion about rifling, not improving accuracy, is coming from. And also explains why in the newly announced upgrade package to the Challenger, labelled Challenger 3, the Brits have replaced the rifled gun with the smoothbore, with the belief that high explosive filler smart rounds will make up for the loss of hash, allowing it to maintain that all-important infantry support element. But first, it's Britain's least favourite morning talk show, Breakfast with Jackie. So I'm sitting there, right, back in the Buffs Club, chippy sauce on my titties, knickers around me ankles, giving it the wally, and I swear, Donna, it stank like a pack of Monster Munch. Monster Munch, Jackie. Aye, pickled onion flavour, crunch and all. Didn't taste that half bad though. Oh, hello, and welcome back to Breakfast with Jackie. My name's Jackie, it's 1:30 in the afternoon, you've just woken up, and this is breakfast. The proper breakfast of champions of whatever you have in the fridge, paired with a lovely bottle of chili sauce. And a couple of aspirins. As my great-grandmother used to say, you've never lived till you've been glassed outside of spoons at 3 AM, waited 5 hours to be seen, accident and emergency, given up, went home, and burned through half your weekly shopping budget on something you'll take 3 bites out of and then fall asleep. Truly, we are the greatest nation of people on God's green earth. But Jackie, you might be shouting at the TV, what's a wash it doing with? Well, your regular boy may turn to that most traditional of British drinks, 3 cans of lager, but as we all know, lager contains carbs, and carbs are the reason you can't see your grandkids in the shower. Thanks to Susan Fay Weight Watchers for that lovely picture of her husband, by the way. I'll be saving that one for later. So you want to hydrate, you want to keep healthy, but you didn't want a big dose of carbs and sugar and caffeine that's going to keep you awake for the next 1.5 hours and then you fall asleep just in time for Golden Balls. That's the real show, by the way. That's why I've partnered with GamerStop. Not only is it keto friendly, it's also sugar free and provides an easy alternative to energy drink which contained more sugar than my last diabetes blood check. How's it taste, Donna? That's no bad. Thanks, Donna. I like the cup it comes in. You like the tits, Donna? I like the tits, aye. Donna was Tit Munchin' Champion of the Year back in, what was it, 97, Donna? 97, Jackie, aye. Well, thank you, Donna. And don't forget, if you want your own funny wake-up powder with matching boob cup, use code LASER for 10% off your purchase. The link is in the description. Any of them taste like Monster Munch, Jackie? Sadly, no. But this one does taste like my ex-husband's cock. And that's all we've got time for on Breakfast with Jackie. Tune in next week where the girls will be showing you 99 bedroom tips and tricks to spice up your bedroom life that you can do at home with a sausage roll. Contract obligation over. Okay, I don't want to pad the running time of this video by going over the extremely long and complicated history of the Challenger, or go over the fact that yes, it has a boiling vessel, so it can make tea, making it the single greatest tank in the world, something which is required by law to point out since every single British historian covering the tank seems to mention it, forgetting of course that it's because British MREs are boil in the bag. Well, they were. I don't know if they still are like that. I don't keep up with the British MRE world. Maybe they're completely different by now.
French baguette. Generally in the field, you'll finish with a cheese.
So instead, I'll just go over some of the more concrete rumours that typically flare up when people start talking about the Challenger. Because there is this idea, possibly coming from the whole Britain cannot afford modern weapons and cancels everything cool, which is a fair assessment to be honest, that the Challenger family of tanks is based on the principle of good enough. That it's basically an upgrade to the Chieftain, originally built for Iran, which Britain was left with after the Iranian Revolution and just kind of accepted it into service because what else are we going to do with all these tanks? That is half true. The Challenger 1 was originally designed as an upgrade package for Iran's chieftain called the Shir-2. When Iran revolted in 1978, this deal for new tanks fell through. The Challenger was then proposed to the MOD, who accepted it into service. It's kind of well known that the Brits were designing their own replacement to the Chieftain called the MBT-80 at around the same time, which is a design considered by many to be vastly superior to anything else proposed, including the Challenger. And it was in fact time constraints and having a tank ready quickly enough to compete with the Soviet T-80, as well as the potential loss of skilled workers at the factory in Leeds where the Shir-2 was being developed, that pushed Britain into accepting the good enough tank over the superior design. This is sort of true, but not really. Most of the design of the Shir-2 was altered to fit the needs of a British tank at the time. It wouldn't be fair to say that the design proposed for Iran and the eventual production Challenger were the same tank, nor would it be precisely fair to call it an upgraded Chieftain. There is about a 70% commonality between the Chieftain and the Challenger. If you trained on the Chieftain and then switched to the Challenger, a lot of the systems on board would be familiar to you. But the Challenger comes with a completely different armor package with its Chubbin armor. For the Chieftain to have the same level of armor protection as the Challenger with its mixture of steel and composite, it would need to be about 200 tons in weight. Challenger also comes with a completely new engine and suspension, allowing it to far exceed the Chieftain in terms of engine power, and a lot of the technologies that were developed for the MBT-80 would eventually find its way onto the Challenger. The tank that failed the 1987 Canadian Army Trophy because it turned out the gun sights didn't work in the rain was a completely different tank to the one which saw action in Desert Storm. Through these gradual system upgrades and improvement in crew training, the Challenger 1 became an absolute beast that was on par to probably an M1A1 Abrams, if somewhat less mechanically reliable. And that's where the problems begin. Because it is British, so obviously there is going to be their own little host of problems. As Operation Desert Storm was getting underway, only about 1/3 of Britain's Challenger 1 fleet was operational. That wasn't really a fault of the tank, it was more the government who bought it. The Brits, in classic British fashion, in order to save money, didn't order enough spare parts, so one half of the fleet had to be cannibalized in order to serve the needs of the other. This is not something that would have been saved by the MBT-80, and what a lot of people fail to understand is by the time the famously constrained British budget was ready to put the MBT-80 into mass production, the Challenger was already equally as capable. Hi, post-production Lazerpig here still. There is a pub full of former Challenger 1 crews that I live next to that will be very angry unless I get this one right. So yes, there is a lot of problems with the Challenger. It wasn't just lack of spare parts, it's all to do with the engine. It was designed by Rolls-Royce, but built by them. And if you don't know who they are, you know what, just go watch Intergalactic Binman's video on the rover if you really want to know why every single British person just squirmed a little in their chair at the mention of that shall not be named. As a result of this, the engine had a multitude of failures, including the cylinder pads just overheating and cracking apparently at random, which caused the coolant to leak onto the exhaust manifold and caused huge plumes of white smoke to fart out of the exhaust, which was a bit problematic. And replacing this took hours, sometimes days depending on severity. And this was at a time where tanks like the Abrams and the Leopard had power packs that could just be easily lifted straight out of the tank and replaced within little over an hour. In fact, the modern Abrams, is one of its major strengths is if you have an issue with the engine, it's easier for the maintenance crew just to rip the engine out and install a new one, because that takes about 45 minutes. Actually fixing the engine, that can take hours. And I mean, yes, it's all to do with what the team have on hand. Engineering vehicles aren't carting around 20 spare Abrams engines with them wherever they go, but you get the idea. With the upgrade to the Challenger 2 program proposed sometime in the late 80s, this would bring the Challenger up to the same standards as the more modern Leopard 2 tanks, as well as fix a lot of the Challenger 1's problems. Again, Challenger 2 brings this idea that it's an upgrade package to the Challenger 1, which is in itself an upgrade package to the Chieftain. So you can kind of see why people who maybe haven't read up on the full history of the design think that the current British Challenger 2 tank is just a heavily modified Chieftain, a tank that entered service in the 1960s. It is not. Compared to the Challenger 1, the Challenger 2 shares just 5% commonality. It would be wrong to call it the Challenger Mark II. It's a completely different tank. Even the hull, which looks similar, is not the same. So no, you cannot penetrate the frontal plate with a gun from World War II. But of course, we can sit here and argue about your favourite tank until the cows come home. But what really matters is how the tank actually performs in combat. And that's where things get interesting. Ukraine has been asking for modern tanks since before the invasion began. Russia threatened to significantly escalate the situation if said tanks were provided, which caused Germany to drag its feet on approving the transfer to Leo 2 tanks to Ukraine, citing that it didn't want to become an accessory to escalation that might lead to World War III, something that would become Germany's signature move throughout this war. Britain, however, had no such quarrels. On the 14th of January 2023, with its massive bulging balls of Rule Britannia ringing in the breeze, it announced that 30 AS-90 artillery systems and 14 Challenger 2s would be delivered to Ukraine. These were the first Western tank designs to be promised to Ukraine, and the first to arrive. And Russia responded by, well, doing nothing. A move that would become its signature throughout this war. This is not the first time Britain had done this. It was one of the first to provide long-range munitions, again in defiance of German indecision, and when the US dragged its feet on supply of HIMARS systems, the UK promised a number of its own MLRS systems, and also provided several minesweeping and patrol vessels. It is perhaps Britain that has suffered the most under what is called the debauchery of the Russian oligarchs. Putin's oligarchs saw London as their second home. They sent their children to prestigious English schools and bought houses and mansions in Kensington. They brought with them obscene amounts of money, which pushed London's prices and house market to the point of collapse. They bought newspapers and banks, lawyers' offices, PR firms, football teams, and made substantial donations to the Conservative Party and to the Brexit campaign. Russian oligarchs rubbed shoulders with the British elites. They were the guests of politicians, of influential lords, and of royalty. But it came with a price. With PR firms and newspapers at their disposal, the opinions of the British public became heavily influenced, unwittingly, by the Kremlin. The British courts became the playthings for oligarchs to fight their petty rivalries, and for Putin to legally hunt down and destroy his enemies, such as in the case of Boris Berezovsky, a fierce Putin critic who was found dead in his bathroom in his UK home in 2013. In spite of obvious suspicions, Scotland Yard refused to investigate, and the whole case was left down to an underfunded local constabulary who quickly determined that it was suicide and moved on. London became the home of the Russian mafia, who used it to hide from the FBI and CIA, who legally cannot operate on British territory. Several oligarchs even made it into the House of Lords, and still sit on its benches with the power to vote on British laws. Russian money found its way into every avenue of British society, and the Brits were happy to bend over backwards to fit every whim of those oligarchs, as they treated their country like their own personal plaything, so long as the money kept flowing. And now that the fog has lifted, that Putin has threatened the UK with nuclear war several times, and the people who preached that he was a friend to Britain have been made to look like idiots, many British elites and politicians have begun to realise that Putin played them for fools. So potentially, quite possibly, Britain's willingness to provide Ukraine with weapons, especially when everyone else was hesitant, might have been because Britain didn't see an opportunity for kinship or genuine concern about the plight of the Ukrainian people, but instead, Britain saw an opportunity for vengeance. With the deployment of the Challenger, finally, the age of the Teeaboo had come. Finally, Britain was leading the charge, and hails of "Shut up, Yank!" echoed in the hallowed halls of the internet. Should anyone dare question the prowess of this machine? Because finally, we would be vindicated when footage would be released of a Challenger 2 blowing up a Russian tank. Or that was the theory anyway. It was a somewhat disappointing and sobering time for every Teeaboo, both current and former, that rumours of the planned expansion of Ukraine's Challenger fleet from 14 to 24 turned out to be false. The 79 Challenger 2 tanks Britain has in mothballs were to be broken up for museum displays or spare parts, not shipped to Ukraine. And as the Ukrainian crews finished their training and were shipped back home with their new vehicles, video footage of any Challenger 2s were suspiciously absent from the newsreels, and so the British waited, and waited, and waited, and waited, and got nothing. Outside of the endless reels of training footage, the only news the British public ever got that a Challenger had seen combat was when one was destroyed south of Avdiivka, in a manner the Russians claim was 100% definitely them. They just changed their mind on how they did it every 2 weeks or so. The crew didn't destroy the vehicle themselves when it became unrecoverable, thus negating Russia's claim to be the first nation to destroy a Challenger 2 in active combat. Absolutely not! Russia hit it with a missile, which caused the ammunition to detonate, separating the turret from the chassis. Never mind that in the first video we see the fire is coming out of the driver's hatch and not the back bit where the ammo is, and the turret is very much still attached. Just ignore that. It had become apparent to many who were watching this war that the Challengers were not really seen as great assets by the Ukrainians, that the gesture of these tanks was token, not serious, built to force Putin's hand, show that he was bluffing, and make Germany more akin to agreeing to the transfer of the Leopard 2, a tank which overall is better suited to Ukraine's current needs and could be made available in a much higher number. Sending the Challengers to Ukraine was just a political move, and as much as that is unsatisfying, it is unfortunately the best Britain can hope to achieve in its current state. The British military budget is in absolute shambles. Though it is far from defenseless, it is in a position where it is forced to pick and choose what it does. Britain's defense plans require an extremely sophisticated and radar missile defense system, which it has, an exceptionally competent air force, which it kind of has, and an exceptionally powerful navy, which it almost has. But in land wars, Britain has assumed it would always be playing second fiddle to the US, there to support, not be the vanguard, at which point a first-rate tank fleet was just never required, when a second-rate would do the job just as well. As such, Britain now lacks the capability to produce new Challenger hulls or replacement barrels. 148 out of Britain's 227 Challengers will be upgraded to Challenger 3, and this will likely be the final modernisation package of the hull. And thus, as eager as the T-Boos are for that final showdown between the Challenger and a Russian T-90, the one video that will be overplayed again and again and become the hallmark of British culture as much as images of Spitfires flying over Dover, it was becoming very apparent that, especially as American Abrams began arriving in Ukraine, it was never going to happen. Until now. The Sun was offered exclusive access to the division currently operating the Challenger 2 tanks, and the reviews from the Ukrainians are, well, they're interesting to say the least. For one, it gives us not only insight into how the Challengers are performing, but how the Ukrainian Western tank arm is performing as a whole, and some of the problems they face. It offers an explanation as to the somewhat lackluster performance we've seen so far. Now, the Sun is not exactly Britain's most prestigious newspaper. It's what we call a tabloid, a newspaper that focuses on sensationalism. In spite of being the largest paid newspaper in circulation in Britain, its clientele are, on average,
dying the life of a true Brexit geezer.
You know the type. Newspapers like The Sun are read backwards. They start with the sports news on the back, have a quick glance through the larger stories, and then throw it in the trash. In terms of the Ukrainian war, The Sun has almost exclusively farmed content by downloading videos from Twitter, slapping their watermark on the top, and then reposting it uncredited to their own YouTube channel, which, because they're a media news source, means that they can show pictures of explosions, gunfights, and corpses without getting flagged or demonetized by YouTube, allowing them to effectively steal content. YouTube. However, The Sun is owned by famous Dark Lord of the Sith, Rupert Murdoch, meaning it's one of the few British media sources not owned by a Russian oligarch. The journalist who did all this, Jerome Starkey, is a man who, in my opinion, is completely overqualified for the position of journalist with The Sun. Starkey is no stranger to war or war zones and has been involved in frontline reporting in just about every major or minor conflict since 2006. But he is most well known for his exposé on the 2010 Gardes night raid, in which US Special Forces accidentally killed 5 innocent civilians, including 2 pregnant women and a teenage girl, and then attempted to cover it up. This inspired the Oscar-nominated film Dirty Wars. He's also been deported from numerous countries for his reporting on the atrocities and civilian massacres, which makes him, as far as I'm aware, more credible as a source than someone on Twitter. So let's go over what he found. In the subject of how the Challengers are actually doing, now I know I have a little bit of an invested interest in this, but I am trying to stay neutral here, because really, the only major interesting thing is that the Ukrainians don't really reveal anything we didn't already know. They praise the gun for its accuracy and its ability to fire while moving, training on targets the size of dinner plates at ranges of 4.5 kilometers away, or 47.5 football fields to my American friends. They noted that this level of range and accuracy could not be achieved on Soviet models, which they put down to the laser rangefinder, which has the capability to track targets at about 10 kilometers away. They praised the armor, noting that the Challenger is capable of shrugging off hits that would ammo rack a Soviet tank, and though they avoided saying it directly, they seemed to act as if this knowledge had come from first-hand experience. But the biggest difference they noted was that Western tanks were built for their crews. They were more comfortable, they were better protected, they were built to a much higher standard and easier to maintain, noting that things that could take days to repair in a T-80 take mere hours in a Challenger. Now this is significant because the crews of these Challengers are not, as I originally believed, fresh-faced recruits, but it turns out they are in fact made up mostly of the former crews of T-80 tanks, one of the better tanks the Soviets ever produced, and many of them also have experience in T-64s and T-72s, and their experience in both these tanks gives us very valuable insight into the differences between the two. The better armor, the more powerful and accurate gun, the better ease of maintenance, as well as just being more comfortable of a tank to operate in. But these are things we already know. Any armor expert, even an enthusiastic hobbyist, can sit down and tell you that these are the main differences between Western and Soviet armor. The more telling differences come from when the Ukrainians are talking about the negatives, the things they don't like about the Challenger. The first thing I should point out is that the Ukrainians are about as eager to get that footage of them blowing up a Russian tank as I am to watch it, because honestly, if I ever do get footage of a Challenger 2 blowing up a T-90M, I'll just retire at that point. Nothing will ever be funnier. Heck, I'll pay for the advertising space to put that video up on one of those big Times Square style boards they've got in Piccadilly. What are you gonna do, Vatniks? Comment at me on Twitter? Oh no! F*** off. But the most significant problem they are having is that the Russian tankers are just not coming out to play. Instead, they will remain well outside firing ranges and not respond to attacks. Russian tanks do not want to get into combat with Western designs and will typically stay far out of range and only come into range if the battalion defending that position is also using Soviet-built models. Now this does make a lot of sense. Out of all the combat footage we've had, excluding the two Bradleys bullying a T-90, we've only had one proper tank-on-tank battle with Soviet and Western designs, which was a Leopard 2A6 taking potshots at two T-80s. Russian tankers might be refusing to come fight simply because the Russians don't want footage like this leaking all over the internet, but it also makes more tactical sense. I'll give the Russians credit for that. If you are in a Soviet-era tank, you do not want to have to fight something that was built to take down the specific tank you are in. Now, the Ukrainians did indicate the Russians do seem to fear Western designs, especially when they first started arriving, but this perceived idea that the Russians would leap out of their trenches and run at the sight of a horde of Western armor bearing down on them is what lost the Ukrainians that counter-offensive. The Ukrainians waited too long till significant amounts of that armor was available, and because they knew it was coming, because they had so much prep time, the Russians were dug in and well prepared, with a multi-layered minefield that had mines often stacked 3 or 4 on top of each other, which completely negated a lot of Ukraine's demining equipment, leading to images like this. The Russians also had considerable stockpiles of anti-armor weapons, including the much-feared Ka-52, which, even though Russia has lost a lot of them, and I do mean a lot of them, they still continue to be a problem. Effectively, Russia has finally realized that massive tank hordes no longer work, and it only took them to lose nearly 120% of their active pre-war tank fleet, that is over 2,800 tanks by the way, to finally realize this. And the big question is, has Ukraine realized this as well? A major complaint of the Ukrainian tankers was that their commanders just don't understand the differences between Soviet and Western tanks and the philosophies of battle which dictate their design. Their commanders are at heart Soviet trained, not Western trained. Yes, they have Western advisors, but those advisors are limited in their role, and there is something of a sense of disregard when you are being advised on how to use your country to fight Russians by someone who has never fought Russians in their life, when you have been fighting them for over a decade now, and we are seeing evidence of this on certain fronts. Tanks are operating independently without support. Now, this is not something any tank, for that matter, should be doing. The reason we got that footage of those Bradleys bullying that T-90 is because that T-90 was somewhere it should never have been. It was alone, it was cut off from support. The Ukrainians had been using Bradleys as fast response vehicles, so when a Russian offensive breached the front lines, that's what showed up. Had that T-90 been part of a squad of T-90s or had the correct support in place like is supposed to happen, those Bradleys would never have been so effective. This might be part of the reason why you are seeing Ukraine use tanks, especially in recent months with the Abrams, in the manner that they are, willing to take more risks with them, because if they lose one, the crew typically gets out and runs away, as opposed to get vaporized in a Soviet vehicle. But also because Bradleys can take down a Soviet-era tank, kind of, but will likely only disable it. The two that took down that T-90 were fighting for a very long time. They put themselves at considerable risk and ended up burning through most, if not all, of their ammo. Ammo Ukraine doesn't have. So a tank showing up as part of a rapid response force helps alleviate that concern. If a tank is part of the Russian breakthrough, then you have a tank on your lines that can, well, deal with it without wasting half its ammo. But this kind of thing also attracts drones. Russia has invested a lot of resources into elite anti-drone units, as the loss of any of these tanks is a huge propaganda victory, and so far neither side have really any effective ways of dealing with suicide drones. This is roughly why you don't see much footage of these tanks in action. Like Ukraine, Russia is suffering a manpower and equipment shortage. It has to pick and choose where to dictate priority. It has assumed that wherever those Western tanks are is the place Ukraine is dedicating its priority, and its bots are constantly scouring through social media looking for any hint of where they might be. Ukraine doesn't want Russia to figure out where they are, so units with Western tanks, once they've seen enough action and the heat starts to build and Russia starts to figure out where they're seeing combat, they are rotated off the front line, so that when those elite anti-tank drone units do show up, they are left scouring an empty field. This is why the only footage we ever get from the Russian side of their drones blowing up Western tanks is when the tank is already stopped, abandoned, and with its hatches open. But Ukraine doesn't have ways of mass transporting these tanks around like we do, so they are often forced to travel those vast distances on their own power, which has led to mechanical issues as well as the tracks just being worn out. In spite of what the pro-Russian crowd loudly proclaim on Twitter, because when do they ever get anything wrong, the challengers have indeed seen combat. But because the Russian tanks refuse to come out to play, rather than tank-on-tank battles, which is far more exciting, what instead they've been doing is using these challengers to snipe at enemy fortifications, especially bunkers and fortified dugouts, at ranges of up to 3 miles away. Which is not as exciting as a tank-on-tank battle. You're shooting at distant targets with high explosives. No one cares about that, so that doesn't really get, the algorithm going, look at this exciting video, everyone doesn't notice. But anyway, this has been both a blessing and a curse with the Challenger. While the tank is very good at this sort of role, its weight has been a problem, with the tankers complaining that unless you keep the speed up, the tank will sink into the mud. Now, this is a known problem with the Challenger and has been for quite a while. It's about 64 tons, which doesn't make it particularly heavier than any other Western tank, but when fully loaded and with all its additional armor packages, it can top out at 83 tons, which is getting into Yak Tiger territory. Now, the Ukrainians are not using those additional armor packages as seen on the Challengers in Iraq, opting instead for slat armor and cope cages, so we're maybe looking at the high end of maybe about 68 tons, which wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for the tank's somewhat underpowered engine, which, though it makes it one of the fastest Western tanks there is, the flip side is that it doesn't have the torque to go from standing still to moving if, say, it's half buried in a ditch. or halfway up a hill. Most of the time, it's terrain depending, okay? So occasionally, you do end up with scenes like this, which were proudly shared by the Vatniks, who don't get a lot of wins these days, so, you know, they're scraping the bottom of the barrels. That's fine. Just let them have their fun. They're over there. They're not really doing any harm. But the Ukrainians put stuff like this down to more driver rookie error, not the fault of the tank. They're being kind. They're being very kind. The flip side is, this has forced the Ukrainians to learn something that most Soviet tankers don't really train for, which is fire on the move. Now, that's not to say that Soviet tankers never trained to fire on the move. They did. They absolutely did. Sources on that kind of vary. For the sake of transparency, 3 former Soviet tankers I spoke to, a former Warsaw Pact T-72 commander I met at the Tank Museum, a former Soviet T-72 gunner living in America that I'm sort of pen pals with, and my ex-boyfriend who used to drive T-72s and later T-90s, all say different things in that respect. I suspect it's probably something being lost in translation. Soviet tankers were trained to fire on the move, it's just that to fire accurately, especially with the T-72, they had to slow to a crawl, whereas the Challenger 2 and other Western tanks will fire as accurately, moving at 25 miles per hour, than they will standing still. So it's more likely that Ukrainians are just having to get used to the idea of firing on the move at speed, not, you know, move, slow down, fire, then speed up. Also, there is a disparaging difference between the experiences of someone who operated tanks in East Germany and drove Czech-built T-72s, someone who operated the original T-72 Ural in the 70s, and someone who was a conscript in the 2010s and claims they had to start a bonfire under the tank just to get the engine to start in winter. But this hasn't been the biggest problem, because in spite of everything, Ukraine wants more Challengers. In spite of it being cumbersome and overweight, in spite of it just not being as technologically advanced as the newer Leopards, they love the damn thing. They want more, as many as we can give them. But this is just not something we can do. Out of the 14 Challenger 2s sent to Ukraine, only 7 are still active. 1 has been destroyed and the rest have either been damaged or suffered some sort of technical fault. Now, these can be put back into service, apart from the destroyed one. That one's but the supply of replacement parts from Britain is incredibly slow, and the Ukrainians never know when they're actually going to get any. This has been a problem Ukraine is having across the board. It's running low on these spare parts because we cannot produce enough for our own needs in peacetime, let alone the wartime needs of another nation. And keep in mind, Ukraine just needs spare parts for 13 tanks. But it's not just spare parts, it's ammunition, it's support systems, it's logistics. We can send Ukraine all the tanks they want. Unless the support for them is in place, then they are about as worthless as chocolate currency. Russia caught us with our pants down, and Ukraine is paying the price for it. And I want to briefly explain why this happened. The Soviet Union is over, and the overwhelming majority of people in this community never lived under its oppression or fear of its aggression. The Cold War is, to anyone under 40, especially in America and Western Europe, remembered exclusively in the scare tactics of the American propaganda machine, of the wars America fought out of the fear of communism and of the ridiculous measures it took to defend itself, of the times we came so close to nuclear annihilation for what often seems like utterly stupid reasons. The fear of Russia and the idea that Russia is still our enemy is seen as a symptom of an outdated paranoia, the work of a propaganda machine and nothing more. So if you told anyone prior to this war that Russia was a threat, you would be laughed out of the room. And that's exactly what happened when both Obama and Trump visited the EU to try and get it to take the Russian threat more seriously and stop relying on America for protection. Hi, me again. I'm probably giving Trump too much credit here. He really just reiterated Obama's original talking points, but did it in such an angry, childlike manner and was so rude to everyone at the conference that no one was really prepared to take him seriously, which probably didn't help. Let me explain something. I know this is a video about the Challenger, and we're 14 tangents deep at this point, but shut up, okay? At around the same time Putin was just getting into power, there was a meme circulating the internet called Meanwhile in Russia. Russians were just discovering the internet, and the images they were uploading to social media were pretty crazy. But the problem was, this viral sensation was portraying the Russians as a country of low IQ, impoverished rednecks. And so Russia, having the weakest and most fragile ego of all countries, began making huge efforts to try and backtrack this. First, they made their own version of the meme, which showed Russians being more badass than dumbass, often featuring scantily clad women. Next, they tried cute little stories of all the amazing things Russia has done and all the inventions it claims ownership of. And then finally came the Russia Strunk meme, where viral videos like this were showcased. And at the same time, there was a rush of history books, all told from the Russian perspective, that were quickly translated into English and sold at American bookstores, along with DVDs of state-funded World War II documentaries and films, some of which were so erroneous they're almost comedy. Included in this was sales of replicas, uniforms, medals, and other accessories. Members of the tank hobbyist crowd, especially modelers and tabletop wargamers, were the primary target, as well as airsofters and reenactors who were offered anything from authentic Russian ration packs to replica guns to complete the illusion. Even games like War Thunder and World of Tanks were funded and offered unprecedented access to historical vehicles so that they could be accurately recreated in-game for the players. If you developed a love for Soviet vehicles and/or the Soviet aesthetic between the years of 2009 and 2014, this was probably why. The minds behind this campaign would go on to found the Internet Research Agency, a government-funded organization run by Brzogan, former leader of the Wagner PMC, well, until his plane fell out of the sky. An organization which used mass fake accounts known as bots to try and manipulate the public opinion in the West. Remember that big Ebola scare back in 2014? That was them. They are suspected to be behind a lot of the early support for the candidacy of Donald Trump, as well as interference in the Brexit campaign. I'm working on a different video about that and have been since January. It's ballooned into a far more complicated topic than I thought it would be, and I've had to ask for help, hence why I'm being so slow in uploads recently. I apologize for that. But if you're watching this in the future and that video's already been published, then you're fine. You know, you just go watch that. Please. Keep the algorithm liking me. I need the money. Wine is expensive, okay? But the long and short of it is, no one in this day and age really saw Russia as a threat. Anyone who did was hand-waved away as an aged paranoid, so military spending gradually became a taboo subject. The budget of the army was seen as inflated and pointless, with money better spent on education and hospitals, and who could blame them? The Cold War was over. We don't need giant standing armies and armadas of nukes anymore. So gradually, we disarmed. The new enemy was terrorists, not communism, and any nation that supported terrorists would be very easily swept aside with just what we could maintain with peacetime production. The idea that we could step up to wartime production if needed was there, but no active measures were actually taken to implement this. The idea of global warfare in our lifetime was a ridiculous notion, stupid even. In Europe, this became especially true because, well, you don't need a huge military budget to protect America's flank from an enemy whose great armored fist is a 50 cal welded to a Toyota Hilux. As a result, Challenger 2 and the projects like it were never seen as being required to do anything more than take on hordes of outdated export models of T-55s and T-72s run by whatever despot dictator America was mad at today. Artillery and ammo production was only there to fill stockpiles, many of which were being seen as unnecessary, and weapon systems development was funded almost entirely by the export market. NATO war planners did not plan for any kind of attrition-based warfare. It was just assumed that the threat from Russia was long over and that China was America's problem, so everyone could just relax and free up some much-needed capital from their over-bloated military budgets. And so long as Putin's oligarchs were throwing money around and living the high life in Europe, then no one was none the wiser. When Eastern Europe told us this was a trick, we ignored them. When former KGB members and Yeltsin's elite fled Russia and warned us insurmountably that this was all a trick, we ignored them. Our weakness was greed, and now Britain cannot maintain a wartime fleet of just 14 tanks. Its own domestic fleet is still living on the scrapped remains of the previous fleet, when Britain reduced its tank numbers from 387 to 227 in 2010, under then Prime Minister David Cameron, who allegedly received some of the biggest gains from the Russian oligarch donations. Coincidentally, he would also preside over the decommissioning of HMS Illustrious and Ark Royale, leaving Britain with no carrier fleet, as well as the forced retirement of all the remaining Harriers, leaving Britain with no naval air arm, the delay of Britain's Britain's replacement of its aging nuclear submarine fleet, the decommissioning of the Type 22 frigate, and the overall reduction of the size of the Royal Navy, including the loss of 5,000 personnel, the watering down of the capabilities of the Type 45 destroyer, and the retirement of the Nimrod, which left Britain with no anti-submarine defence, the withdrawal of all 20,000 British troops from bases in Germany, the retirement of the C-130 fleet, the retirement of the Tornado, and the attempted cancellation of one of the newer carriers Britain was building at the time. But I'm sure that was all just a coincidence. This man is currently the Foreign Secretary. The major problem with the Ukraine situation is that while the Republicans are doing everything to delay American aid to Ukraine, Europe has been forced to step up. It has been confronted with a new reality where the idea that America will steamroll in to save the day is now no longer a guarantee, and for once it can no longer afford to be complacent. It is no longer the support element, it is the vanguard. Yes, it's me, ya boy, post-production Lazerpig, back at it again with another interruption. Okay, at the time of writing and recording, this was all still true. The absolute second I upload the first draft of this video to YouTube, the Republicans suddenly grow a pair and the bill to supply further aid to Ukraine is pushed through in what must be record time. I guess that's the one thing that can always truly unite Americans, dotting on the Europeans. And that's the problem. Europe simply cannot provide everything it needs, plus everything Ukraine needs. And so far, no one has been willing to sacrifice their own defense to supplement Ukraine's. It took Europe a full year to produce the shells that Ukraine fired in little over a month. And that's just artillery shells. Things get much worse when you consider small arms ammunition as well as ammunition for aircraft, helicopters, MLRS systems, cruise missiles, etc, etc. Europe just simply isn't making enough of it, and Ukraine has been forced to look further afield to places like Japan and South Korea to meet its needs. And this is why tanks like the Challenger have become so important. That ability to snipe at reinforced dug-in targets from up to 3 miles away means these tanks are now filling the role of artillery, and their ability to do this on the move lessens the capability for Russia to target them with things like drones or with missile systems like the Kornet, the system which supposedly destroyed the first Challenger 2, according to some guy on Twitter. And of course, r/tank porn. This is what counts as a credible source now according to Wikipedia, that famed pillar of informed commentary and intellectual debate, Reddit. Sorry, not just sourced, copied word for word. This is why your teacher slaps you down for citing Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is now referencing Redditors as a source. What a time to be alive. But since I have been a bit of a Debbie Downer this video, I'm going to leave you on a more positive note. Last year, Germany supplied 40,000 artillery shells to Ukraine. This year, it will supply 350,000. Since the war began, Europe has upped its ammo production by about 40%, and new factories and lines are still coming online. In fact, there's a massive new factory being built in Australia just to produce HIMARS ammo. By the end of this year, Europe alone will be producing just over 2 million shells. And while it's nothing compared to the nearly 4 to 5 million that Russia will be producing, keep in mind that Russia fires 7 shells for every 1 that Ukraine fires back. Russia is still heavily reliant on towed artillery pieces. These are effective, but heavy and difficult to move, and shoot and scoot tactics is just not something the Russians regularly trained for. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a greater number of these highly accurate SPG systems at their disposal. These can rapid fire at multiple targets and then move quickly in a little under 2 minutes. Before they were forced to start being conservative with their ammo, Ukraine was winning the counter-battery war. Russia started this war with 14,600 towed artillery pieces in storage, now has just over 6,000 left according to Covert Cabal, who counted the pieces they could see via satellite images. But according to the Royal United Services Institute, many of those are not in particularly good condition and may even date from the Second or First World War, and in fact they have closer to about 4,000 serviceable artillery pieces. And as more artillery shells arrive and Ukraine can restart its counter-battery operations, Russia may have to finally start being more conservative with its artillery usage, and this will significantly weaken their capabilities. They've already had to start relying more heavily on their air force, which has caused a considerable number of airframe losses in recent months, and though they are producing more planes than they lose each year, it's not airframes they are running low on, it's pilots. Russia is gradually running out of everything. Its inheritance from the Soviet Union has been depleted faster than expected, and its domestic manufacturing capability is struggling to keep up with orders. It has had to buy in shells and drones from Iran and North Korea. That should be an indication of how everything is going for them. If you're looking at the current state of the Ukraine war and watching with utter disbelief as Russian troops charge across no man's land in golf carts and bicycles and a garden shed in what appears to be something resembling suicidal human wave tactics, this is why. It's not poor planning or because Russian generals are drinking their own weight in vodka each day, it's desperation. Europe is rebuilding its armed forces. All the influence Putin had over Britain and the EU to stop or delay that has pretty much evaporated, and by the end of this year, all the work done to weaken Europe over the past 2 decades will be completely undone. Putin is running out of time, and he knows it. He needs to end this war before Europe and America get their shit sorted out and supplies start arriving in force. 33 replacement Leopards have already been earmarked. 60 F-16s will come from Europe alone, along with millions of dollars worth of anti-air, radar, and demining equipment. Freedom called, and it was Europe that answered the phone. And though the Challenger was just a political move and the real heroes would always be the Leopards or the Abrams, which had shorter supply lines from Poland and Germany and would always be available in higher numbers, the Challenger has been effective. It's doing its job, and it's doing it well, and it's earned the respect of its Ukrainian crews. And if this is to be Britain's last moment of significance in military history, it is at least proud that its last great huzzah was the defiant roar of cannon fire, and not the whimpering of spineless politicians.